The title of my discussion this morning is Email in the Modern Healthcare World. But the theme I'm going to talk about is why or whether email is evil. And a lot of us know this inherently, that email is evil. It's taking over our daily lives. We wake up with it in the morning. We deal with it all day. We manage it. We delete it. We send it. We forward it. And then we go to sleep with it at night sometimes. We're dreaming about it, but the last thing many of us do at night before we go to bed is to check our email and try to deal with it, knowing the next day we're going to wake up with a new flurry. And so in the modern healthcare world, we are the equivalent of hoarders. We stick things away in crooks and crannies. We do this inherently. We do it in our daily lives around our houses, maybe not to this extreme, but Aunt Jenny's juicer, Uncle Ralph's reflectors, we save everything. We save everything, and now the modern day equivalent of the hoarder is the inbox, the deleted box. I recently had a CEO, I collected all of his email in one sitting. He had 24,000 emails in his inbox. We think we're being more organized than the hoarders of yesterday. We think because we're sticking it in folders and subfolders and sub-subfolders that we're so organized, and we can, on the spot, grab an email from anywhere you need it because we're going to get that one email that's going to save the day. We're going to pull it out of that hoarding that's right there, and we're going to drop it. Bam! I found that email. I needed that email. How often do we really do that, though? How often do we go back to find that one email that's going to save the day, that's going to vindicate us, that's going to prove our innocence? I would posit to you that it rarely happens. Rarely happens. In fact, instead, what we see now is the opposite, and we'll talk about that. But the reason for all of this is that the data is just exploding and exploding. We're having to find places to stick it. But luckily, memory has become so inexpensive, computer memory, that is. I think when I started out, I had a computer with 256 megabytes of storage. That's not on the RAM. That was the hard drive, 256 megabytes. We're lucky if we had 4 megabytes of RAM. That's so infinitesimal now. This is the data that is exploding and is projected to continue exploding into the future. The average custodian only 3 years ago had about 7 gigabytes. Remember, megabytes is what we had 20 years ago. Now we're talking gigabytes. In only a course of about 3 years, that's exploded by threefold. Now we have approximately 31 gigabytes of data. All that data has to go somewhere. We hoard it. We keep hold of it. We keep it mostly in our Outlook box. But why do we save this? Is it to vindicate ourselves? Is it going to save the day one day? I don't think so. Instead, email has become the modern day torpedo to be used against us to sink the ship. And so we need to question whether we need to continue to save it. And if we're doing so, we're going to talk about the etiquette that needs to go along with it, because as Glenn alluded to, email is now the number one thing that government investigators look for to get from us. If you don't think we'll sink the ship, just go ask Hillary. And I'm not saying this in a political context. Lade, coming down from D.C., did a very good job of walking the line, and I'm not trying to take sides here. But when you look at the email debacle that has become focused on Hillary's campaign, you see that the emails that she thought were deleted are coming back to be used against her. Have you seen one email from Hillary that's been published in the newspaper that's been used to vindicate anyone? No. And they knew this, and that's why potentially it was set up. But in the modern day equivalent of a government investigation, the email issues that have gone on with Hillary's campaign would be used against any of you or your companies with vigilance and force. And so we need to really think what's going on with email. As Glenn alluded to, it used to be just the facts, ma'am, when you had a government investigator come. They wanted to know, okay, what's going on here? What's the story? That's all changed. Now the first thing out of their mouth is just the email. We want the email first and foremost. We want it all. We want it fast. We all know why. Because they're going to use it against us. There are loose lips in emails. There are jokes in emails. There are the Caitlyn Jenner, Bruce Jenner emails that we all thought were funny now that are now going to be used against us under the discrimination rules. All those things are coming back to bite us. And so you have to question, one, whether email should even be kept around, and you have to balance this against the overpayment retention rules that Glenn was just talking about. But is it wise to even retain email as much anymore? And I think we have to change our focus. A lot of us think of email as a chronicling tool, and it's really a communication tool. And if we change our mindset on that, we're chronicling every aspect of our life, every minute of our lives, every minute of our business transactions, really email is a communication tool, not a chronicling tool. And when you change that mindset, you can start to see that only a few emails, maybe if you're negotiating a heavy contract, maybe if you have an HR issue where someone's being fired and you need to document why, but you can print those emails and put them in a file very easily, or you can individually save those. And email rarely saves the day. Like I said, I've rarely been involved in a case where somebody brings out that email and says, bam, we're golden, I've got this email. Instead, what we typically see is it's a torpedo being used against us. And I could go through examples as we go through our government investigations. Like I mentioned, a CEO with 24,000 emails in his inbox, the amount of data that we're dealing with. But the government will pick and choose, the plaintiff's attorneys will pick and choose which emails out of all of those that they're going to use against you. They rarely pick out the one that says, oh, this is a good email for you, we're going to let you vindicate yourself with it. No, it doesn't work like that. And they have sophisticated tools to pick out only those emails that are going to be helpful to their cases, both the government and the plaintiff attorneys. But more importantly, production is extraordinarily expensive. I talked about the 31 gigabytes per custodian, 31 gigabytes of data per custodian. Your employer first has to gather that. So I had to go and sit down recently at that CEO's desk, gather that information onto a terabyte thumb drive, and then we have to apply sophisticated software in order to filter out that email, and then it has to be reviewed by attorneys to make sure there's no privileged communications in there. We have to engage consultants to help with all this sorting, and then we have to pay to have it produced and put on a CD to give to the government, only to be used against us. We've spent thousands and thousands of dollars before we then give it to the plaintiff's attorneys and the government, only to have it used against us. Why? Why are we retaining all this stuff that is only going to be primarily to our detriment? It's because we're all hoarders. So if we're going to hoard, we better learn how to hoard right. So if you're going to send email, if your employees are going to send email, if you're going to send email, you better do it right, because it's not a question any longer of if your email is going to be read. It's just a question of when. I'm going to be reading it one day. I've read a lot of your emails here, because we've had to collect them for investigations. I'm reading those CEO emails, and I don't like reading about his financials. I don't like reading about his other stuff that he didn't want anybody to know about. And I've had to read those emails for a lot of other clients, and it causes a lot of problems. So if we're going to be sending email, our tagline for our firm is not if but how. But again, remember, and you can put this on your computer screen, not if but when. And if you have that as your screensaver, it will help you recognize that you and your employers, when you are sending emails, you better do it right, because they're only going to be coming back to haunt you. So there are simple rules. Email etiquette, we all say, oh, I do everything right. I would never send a bad email. The mindset is, well, it applies to everyone but myself. And we got to get over that. I remember there was a recent study out of Mount Sinai about physicians turning out to be the worst as far as infection control. The physicians, the very ones who are supposed to be at the top of the pinnacle, took infection control least seriously. And as it turned out, when they put their hands in a Petri dish, little sample thing, the physicians had the most bacteria on their hands of any provider within the hospital. And what that hospital did was took a picture of that Petri dish, and they put it as a screensaver for every physician and every employee in the hospital. And that's the one thing that finally corrected their infection control. You can do that trick at your nursing home too, but you can do the same thing with your email. Email etiquette is for everyone, and don't forget it. There's a simple rule, a couple simple rules. Treat it like you're sending it to your grandmother. Do you want your grandmother reading that email? Because her reaction is going to be this. You said what? So think of Granny before you send the email. So we've got 2 rules so far, okay? Email etiquette applies to everyone, and treat it like your grandmother is on the other end of the receiving line. So don't joke around, because it's not a question of if, it's just a question of when. Think about how the email will be used against you and your company that you're working for before you send it. Because at some point the government's going to be reading. Don't worry about me reading it. Worry about a plaintiff's attorney reading it. Worry about the government reading it. Worry about OCR reading it and thinking about discrimination as you're sending that joke about Bruce Jenner. So that's the other rule. Secondarily, act like it's going to be published in the newspaper, because it very well may be. It might not offend Granny, but it might offend a lot of your clients and your customers. So even if you're not joking and making an offensive joke that would offend Grandma, think about how it would affect your customers, because these emails, when they're read by plaintiffs' attorneys, the government, and others, may end up being reported on. So treat it like it's going to be published in the newspaper. Don't mix work and personal. I say this in 2 contexts. Don't mix them in your inbox, and try not to mix them in your your actual emails, because you're containing within one email probably some discussion of your personal life when you're trying to discuss business, and the 2 don't really go together. So try to keep those separate. I had a client a hospice provider. They had an internal email system, but they didn't use it. Instead, they let everybody use their own Gmail, AT&T account, Comcast. So what do we have to do? We had to go to each individual person's essentially own private server, collect their Gmail account with all of their kids' baseball schedules, all of their little trysts, everything about them. And I had to get all those emails from each one of those people to find the emails that had to actually deal with the hospice company. So think about that. Do you really want to mix? Do you want people reading your personal email later on? Because it's not a question of if, but just a question of when somebody's going to be reading your email. Don't think it's not going to happen to you. It will. Do not vent in email. You know this. You know all this. It just takes reminding, but you need to remind your staff and employees. So this is somewhat train the trainer time. And this is the 3rd thing to put on your little thing on your desktop, on your computer. Don't vent. We all get the email every once in a while, or we get a text and we're saying, I'm going to craft the perfect response to this. And you spend a couple hours saying, I'm getting out my dictionary, my thesaurus. I'm going to show them I'm smarter than them. I'm more witty. We're crafting that response. We're waiting because we're going to hit send, and it's going to show them, and they're just going to cower down and go away. They don't. It's only going to be used against you, and so it's not time to set the record straight. Email is not a tool for setting the record straight. It does not serve a purpose. You all know it. If you really have to go through that cathartic process of drafting that email to send to someone, go ahead and do it, and then delete it, and pick up the phone and call them and talk about it. But don't send it. So simple takeaways here. Just the facts in the email. Stick to the facts. Don't draw conclusions. You heard Glenn talk about with the new overpayment rules. You say, okay, here's what happened, and therefore the conclusion is we've identified an overpayment. That would just be one example. Or we've determined that this resident was abused. Well, don't put that kind of stuff in an email. Just lay out the facts. The resident had a bruise of unknown origin. We're going to investigate it further. There's always more facts that come to light. There are always more facts that come to light. So don't jump to that conclusion, and tell your employees not to jump to the conclusion. Tell them to lay out the facts and let someone further investigate later on. Obviously, forgo the joke. That's the grandma rule. Do not vent. Don't let the steam come out of your ears, and do not set the record straight. It doesn't do any good. It's only going to be used against you or your company later on, right? Pick up the phone. I would say that's the number 1 rule of today, is to pick up the phone. But don't pick up this phone. Don't think that just because you're texting that you're off the hook. No one's going to look at your text, right? Everybody texts. Nobody looks at my text. Wrong. This is a text log coming from somebody's actual phone, iPhone. We can produce those. The government's starting to look at those more seriously. The collection time and expense for iPhones is terribly expensive. You have an actual log. And you do not want to go through that process of someone saying, okay, every employee needs to bring in their phone for 2 hours, have everything downloaded, all of your pictures, all of your texts. Do you really want that information in the hands of the government or even your attorney looking at all of those stuff? So don't think that just because you're putting it in a text, you can joke around. That's what we used to do on emails a long time ago. We joke around on emails, and then we said, well, we can't do that on emails anymore, so we'll do it on text. Wrong. It's going to be saved. You know when stuff's out there that it sticks around. So that's something that they're looking at. Pick up this phone instead. Call someone, talk about the issue, have a conversation about it. You do not need to chronicle your life. Communication, email is a communication tool, not a chronicling tool. And when we begin to change our mindset about that, I think we'll be a lot more defensible as an industry because we'll be able to tell the story as it existed and not in some chronicling fashion where only the bad stuff is being used against us. And think about whether you need to save email at all. There's a lot of dynamics that go into that, and if you make a decision to say, we're not going to save email the way we used to, we're going to go on an auto-deletion process, that's certainly something that needs to go through your counsel, your compliance officer, and think about the timing for it. There's certain litigation hold issues that can come up. But think about, do you really need to be a hoarder? And I would say that we don't. We need to break that cycle. There are a lot of books out there for our private lives about that now. But there needs to be a book, and hopefully this is a guideline for a lot of you to kind of change your thinking on it. Thank you.